Vancouver, British Columbia erupted into absolute pandemonium last night, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The Rogers Arena, packed with over 18,000 screaming fans, became ground zero for one of the most devastating returns in WWE history. What was supposed to be a night celebrating tribal legacy and brotherhood turned into a bloodbath that nobody saw coming. The question isn't just what happened inside that demonic steel structure, but why now, why Jey Uso, and what does this mean for the landscape of professional wrestling as we know it?
Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare.
Survivor Series War Games 2025 was already being billed as the most anticipated pay-per-view event of the year. 5 men against 5 men, trapped inside 2 rings surrounded by unforgiving steel cage walls. The traditional War Games match had returned to prominence, and this year's installment promised to deliver carnage on an unprecedented scale. Jey Uso, the right-hand man of the tribal chief Roman Reigns, had been positioned as a crucial component of his team's strategy. Main event Jey Uso, as is branded himself, had been riding high on momentum, finally stepping out of his cousin's shadow and carving his own path to glory. The atmosphere inside Rogers Arena was electric. Fans waved their yeet signs with religious fervor, chanting Jey's name as if he were some sort of modern-day gladiator heading into battle.
The production value was unprecedented.
Pyrotechnics exploded in synchronized bursts of flame and light. The War Games structure itself loomed ominously above the double-ring setup, casting shadows across the faces of fans in the front row who paid premium prices to witness history. Little did they know, they were about to witness something far more sinister than they bargained for.
The match began exactly as scripted.
Bodies collided with steel.
Men bled.
The crowd roared their approval with every superkick, every spear, every high-risk maneuver from the top of the cage. Jey Uso was performing at an elite level, showcasing exactly why he'd earned the moniker of main event. His timing was impeccable, his strikes crisp and devastating. He moved through that cage like a man possessed, hitting his signature moves with precision that only comes from years of grinding in the biggest company in the world. Commentary kept emphasizing how this was Jey's moment, his opportunity to prove he belonged in the main event conversation without living in anyone's shadow. Then, at approximately the 58-minute mark of the broadcast, something changed. The lights in Rogers Arena flickered. Once.
Twice.
A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. These weren't planned theatrical light cues. This felt different, wrong, unsettling in a way that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The announce team fell silent, clearly receiving information through their headsets, confusion evident in their suddenly hesitant voices. Michael Cole's usually smooth delivery cracked slightly as he asked his broadcast partner what was happening.
Nobody had answers. Not yet.
The video screens throughout the arena suddenly cut to static, that old-school television snow that generations before streaming services would recognize instantly. The sound was deafening, that harsh white noise that seems to penetrate directly into your skull. Fans pulled out their phones, recording what they assumed was some kind of technical malfunction, completely unaware they were documenting the beginning of an assault that would trend worldwide for the next 72 hours straight. Inside the War Games structure, the competitors had stopped fighting, looking around with genuine concern etched across their battered faces. Even in the world of predetermined outcomes, this felt disturbingly real. Cliffhanger 60-second mark, and then, cutting through that static like a chainsaw through flesh, came a sound that sent shockwaves through the collective nervous system of every wrestling fan in attendance.
A roar. Primal. Animalistic.
Unmistakable. Brock Lesnar was in the building, and someone was about to get hurt. The explosion that followed wasn't just sound and fury.
It was a statement.
The entrance ramp detonated in a cascade of pyrotechnics so intense that fans in the first 10 rows instinctively shielded their faces. Through the smoke and flames emerged a figure that wrestling fans know all too well, a figure that represents legitimate danger in a world of controlled chaos. Brock Lesnar, all 286 pounds of pure destructive force, stood at the top of the ramp wearing that same sadistic smirk that has preceded countless acts of violence throughout his legendary career. But something was different this time. The look in his eyes wasn't the calculated intensity of a performer about to execute a well-rehearsed segment. This was something darker, something personal, something absolutely terrifying. Paul Heyman, Lesnar's longtime advocate and mouthpiece, was notably absent. This wasn't a scripted promo opportunity. This wasn't a carefully crafted return designed to maximize merchandise sales and social media engagement. Brock Lesnar had come to Vancouver for one reason and one reason only, to destroy Jey Uso.
But why?
What could possibly motivate the beast incarnate to target a man he'd barely shared screen time with throughout their respective careers? The answer to that question would redefine everything we thought we understood about loyalty, family, and the brutal politics that exist behind the curtain in professional wrestling.
Lesnar moved down that ramp with terrifying purpose.
There was no showboating, no playing to the crowd, no soaking in the moment. He walked like a predator who had spotted wounded prey and was moving in for the kill. Security personnel, those brave or foolish enough to attempt to intercede, were swatted aside like insects. A 240-pound security guard, a former college football player who probably thought he was tough, made the mistake of stepping into Lesnar's path. One F5 later, and he was laid out on the entrance ramp, probably reconsidering his career choices and definitely filing a workers' compensation claim. Inside the War Games cage, the other competitors had backed into corners, clearly having been given instructions through their earpieces to stand down.
This wasn't part of their match anymore.
This was Brock Lesnar's show now, and when the Beast Incarnate shows up unannounced, you get the hell out of his way or you become collateral damage. The cage door, that supposed impenetrable barrier meant to contain the violence within, meant absolutely nothing to a man who had conquered UFC heavyweight champions and broken The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak. Lesnar grabbed the steel door with both hands and quite literally ripped it off its hinges, the sound of twisting metal screeching through the arena's sound system and causing fans to wince. Jey Uso, to his credit, didn't run. Main event Jey Uso stood his ground in the center of those two rings, chest heaving from exhaustion after nearly an hour of warfare, sweat and blood mixing on his face, knowing full well what was about to happen but refusing to show fear. It was admirable, really. Foolish, but admirable. There's a certain respect you have to give a man who stares down Brock Lesnar and chooses to fight rather than flee. Jey threw the first punch, a desperate right hand that connected solidly with Lesnar's jaw. The Beast's head barely moved.
He smiled. And that's when the nightmare truly began.
What followed over the next 6 minutes can only be described as systematic annihilation. Brock Lesnar didn't just beat Jey Uso. He dismantled him piece by piece with surgical precision, each move calculated to inflict maximum damage and humiliation. The first German suplex sent Jey flying across the ring, his body contorting in midair before crashing into the canvas with a sickening thud that could be heard in the upper deck. Lesnar didn't go for a pin. He pulled Jey back to his feet, laughing as Uso's legs wobbled beneath him, barely able to support his own weight. A second German suplex followed, this one even more violent, Jey's neck and shoulders absorbing the impact in a way that made medical professionals in the audience cringe. The announce team had found their voices again, but they had abandoned all pretense of calling this like a wrestling match. This was a mugging. This was assault. Michael Cole's voice cracked with what sounded like genuine distress as he pleaded for someone, anyone, to stop this. Commentary kept asking where security was, where management was, why nobody was intervening to save Jey Uso from this unprecedented brutality. The truth, which would emerge in the days following this incident, was far more disturbing. Certain people in positions of power had been told to stand down, to let this play out, to allow Brock Lesnar to send a message that would echo throughout the entire wrestling industry. German suplex number 3. Number 4. Number 5. Jey Uso wasn't defending himself anymore. He couldn't. His body had gone limp, operating purely on survival instinct, trying desperately to protect his head and neck from further trauma. The crowd had transitioned from shocked gasps to genuinely concerned murmurs. This had crossed the line from entertaining violence to something that felt dangerously real.
Parents covered their children's eyes. Grown men looked away. This wasn't what they had paid to see.
This was something else entirely, something dark and vicious that belonged in a back alley rather than a professional wrestling ring.
But Lesnar wasn't finished. Not even close.
He hoisted Jey's lifeless body onto his shoulders, holding him there for a moment as cameras flashed throughout the arena, immortalizing this moment of domination. The F5 that followed was delivered with such force that Jey actually bounced off the canvas, his body ragdolling in a way that human bodies shouldn't move. Medical personnel had gathered at ringside, waiting for clearance to enter, their faces masks of professional concern. Referees pleaded with Lesnar to stop, their voices barely audible over the deafening mixture of boos and shocked silence emanating from the Vancouver crowd. Here's where the first twist occurred, the moment that transformed this from a simple beatdown into something far more complex and sinister. As Brock Lesnar stood over Jey Uso's broken body, breathing heavily from exertion rather than exhaustion, the video screens throughout Rogers Arena flickered back to life. But instead of showing the carnage in the ring, they displayed footage.
Archival footage. Recent footage.
Footage of Jey Uso in what appeared to be private conversations, intimate discussions about family, about legacy, about the tribal chief Roman Reigns. And in those conversations, Jay wasn't playing the loyal right-hand man.
He was planning, scheming,
plotting to take everything Roman had built and claim it for himself. The revelation sent shockwaves through the wrestling community. Main event Jey Uso, the man who had fought so hard to earn Roman's trust, who had stood by his tribal chief through countless battles, was apparently planning a betrayal of historic proportions. The footage showed Jey meeting with executives, with board members, with people who had the power to shift the entire landscape of WWE's power structure. He was setting up his own coup, his own hostile takeover, using the platform and credibility that Roman had given him to build his own empire.
And somehow, Brock Lesnar knew about it.
Somehow, the Beast Incarnate had obtained this intelligence and decided to deliver his own form of justice. But who gave Lesnar this information? Who had the resources to surveil Jey Uso's private conversations and the motivation to weaponize them? The cameras panned to the entrance ramp, and there, emerging through the smoke and chaos, stood a figure that made the entire story make horrifying sense.
Paul Heyman,
the special counsel. The wise man Roman Reigns' trusted advisor and the architect of the tribal chief's entire empire. Heyman walked slowly down that ramp, microphone in hand, his expression a mixture of sadness and cold calculation.
This wasn't just Brock Lesnar's attack.
This was a sanctioned hit ordered by the highest levels of power within the bloodline itself. Heyman entered the ring, careful to avoid the pools of Jey's blood that had started to form on the canvas, and stood beside Lesnar. The crowd didn't know how to react. Should they boo?
Should they cheer?
The moral lines had become so blurred that traditional hero-villain dynamics no longer applied. Heyman raised the microphone to his lips, and in that calm, measured tone that has delivered some of the most memorable promos in wrestling history, he explained everything. He explained how Jey's ambition had grown too large, how his plotting threatened to tear apart everything Roman had sacrificed to build. He explained how loyalty within the bloodline wasn't just expected, it was absolutely mandatory, and betrayal carried consequences that went far beyond losing a match or a title opportunity. Most disturbingly, Heyman revealed that Roman knew. The tribal chief knew about Jey's planned betrayal weeks ago, had known and had been planning this response, this public execution designed to send a message to anyone else who might be harboring similar thoughts of insurrection. Brock Lesnar wasn't acting as a rogue agent. He was the instrument of Roman's justice, the enforcer brought in specifically to handle problems that required a level of violence and intimidation that even the tribal chief couldn't personally deliver. And the choice of venue, Survivor Series War Games in front of 18,000 fans and millions watching worldwide, that was deliberate.
This wasn't just punishment.
This was a warning broadcast to the entire roster. The immediate aftermath of Brock Lesnar's assault on Jey Uso played out in real time across every social media platform imaginable. Within minutes, hashtags related to the attack were trending #1 worldwide on Twitter, surpassing actual news events and entertainment stories that typically dominate the cultural conversation. Video clips of the German suplexes, of Jey's body crashing into the canvas repeatedly, of Heyman's chilling explanation, were being shared, dissected, analyzed and memed with the speed and intensity that only modern internet culture can generate.
Wrestling fans weren't just shocked by what they witnessed.
They were fundamentally questioning everything they thought they understood about the current WWE landscape. Medical personnel finally received clearance to attend to Jey Uso approximately 8 minutes after Lesnar's initial assault. Those 8 minutes felt like an eternity to everyone watching, both in the arena and at home. The medical team moved with practiced efficiency, carefully stabilizing Jey's neck and spine using protocols typically reserved for legitimate injuries rather than worked wrestling angles. Twinsiders Mike Johnson reported hearing from multiple independent sources that Jey Uso had indeed been transported to a local Vancouver hospital following the attack, not as a storyline development but for legitimate medical evaluation. According to these reports, Jey was being examined for potential neck and spine injuries, concussion protocols were being administered, and WWE's medical staff was taking extraordinary precautions given the brutality of the assault he'd endured. Other journalists pushed back on these claims, insisting it was all part of the work, that modern wrestling fans had simply lost the ability to distinguish between reality and performance. The truth, as is often the case in professional wrestling, probably existed somewhere in the murky middle ground between those extremes. What couldn't be disputed was the seismic shift this created in WWE's power structure. Prior to Survivor Series War Games, Jey Uso had been positioned as one of the company's most popular and sympathetic characters. His journey from Roman's enforcer to independent star had resonated with audiences in a way few storylines managed to achieve. Merchandise sales for Jey's Yeet branded products had been strong.
His singles matches had consistently delivered.
He represented a success story, a wrestler who had evolved beyond his original role and found his own identity. And in one brutal 6-minute segment, all of that equity was either destroyed or dramatically transformed depending on how WWE chose to follow up on this storyline. The conspiracy theories began almost immediately. Wrestling fans, trained by decades of swerves and double-crosses, started constructing elaborate narratives to explain what they'd witnessed. One popular theory suggested that the footage shown of Jay plotting against Roman was fabricated, deepfake technology utilized to create false evidence justifying an unjust attack. This theory positioned Roman and Paul Heyman as paranoid dictators willing to eliminate threats based on manufactured intelligence, making them clear villains in the story. Another theory proposed that Jay was actually working with Roman to create this angle, that the attack was designed to generate sympathy for Jay while making Lesnar and the Bloodline look like monsters, setting up an eventual babyface revenge storyline. But perhaps the most intriguing theory, the one that gained the most traction in hardcore wrestling circles, suggested that everything viewers had seen was real in the sense that legitimate backstage politics and real-life tensions had been incorporated into the broadcast. This theory claimed that Jey Uso had indeed been lobbying for a more prominent position within WWE's creative structure, that he had been making moves to secure his own future potentially at the expense of Roman's positioning, and that the Bloodline leadership decided to handle this the old-fashioned way, by making an example out of him on international television. Whether Jay was truly planning a coup or simply advocating for his own career advancement had become blurred, weaponized into justification for a public beating. The wrestling industry's response was equally divided. Some veterans praised the segment for its intensity and willingness to blur the lines between reality and fiction in ways that modern wrestling rarely attempts. Mick Foley, no stranger to brutal violence in his own career, posted on social media that while the attack was difficult to watch, it represented the kind of unpredictable, edge-of-your-seat television that had been missing from wrestling for too long. He argued that fans needed to be shocked occasionally, that comfort and predictability were the enemies of compelling storytelling. Other veterans were far less charitable in their assessments. Several former wrestlers, speaking under conditions of anonymity, expressed concern that WWE had crossed ethical lines, that incorporating real-life workplace tensions into entertainment programming created dangerous precedents.
Fan reaction was similarly polarized.
Die-hard Bloodline supporters argued that Jay's betrayal, if real, deserved exactly the response it received.
You don't bite the hand that feeds you. You don't plot against family.
The Bloodline's entire philosophy was built on loyalty and respect for the hierarchy, and Jay had violated both. These fans viewed Lesnar's assault not as villainy but as justified enforcement of group principles. On the other side, Jay's fans were devastated and outraged. They had invested emotionally in his character development, had cheered his evolution into a main event player, and felt betrayed by WWE for destroying that journey in such a brutal, seemingly pointless manner. Many vowed to cancel their Peacock subscriptions or stop watching WWE programming entirely if Jay wasn't properly compensated for this treatment. The business implications were equally significant. WWE's stock had fluctuated wildly in the days following Survivor Series War Games. Initial reports of the segment's shocking nature drove trading volume up significantly, but concerns about potential backlash from sponsors or regulatory authorities created uncertainty. Several major advertisers reportedly reached out to WWE seeking clarification on whether the violence depicted fell within acceptable standards for their brands. WWE's corporate communications team worked overtime crafting statements that emphasized the theatrical nature of professional wrestling while avoiding specifics about what portions of the segment were scripted versus improvised. International markets presented additional complications. The segment aired during primetime hours in North America but was broadcast at various times globally depending on time zones and distribution deals. In several countries with stricter broadcasting standards, the footage of Lesnar's assault was either heavily edited or removed entirely from replays, with announcers simply referencing that an incident had occurred. This created a fragmented viewer experience where audiences in different markets had witnessed fundamentally different versions of the same event, leading to confusion and frustration among the global wrestling community trying to discuss what had happened. Behind the scenes, WWE's creative team was reportedly in crisis mode. The original plans for the coming weeks and months had been built around certain assumptions about character alignments and storyline directions that the Survivor Series attack had fundamentally altered. Emergency creative meetings were called.
Scripts were being rewritten.
Wrestlers scheduled for programs with Jey Uso suddenly found themselves in limbo, uncertain whether those angles would proceed as planned or be scrapped entirely. The entire Monday Night Raw and Friday Night Smackdown writing staffs were working around the clock trying to construct coherent follow-up programming that capitalized on the massive attention while navigating the complex real-life implications. Perhaps most tellingly, Roman Reigns himself had gone completely silent on social media following the attack. The tribal chief, usually active in promoting his character and WWE programming, posted nothing. No acknowledgement, no explanation, no defense of the actions taken against his own cousin. This silence spoke volumes to wrestling fans trained to read between the lines. Some interpreted it as Roman distancing himself from the attack, potentially setting up his own face turn by having regrets about what Lesnar had done under his authority. Others saw it as the ultimate power move, the tribal chief so secure in his position that he didn't feel the need to explain or justify his decisions to anyone, least of all the fans. The question everyone was asking as the week following Survivor Series progressed was simple. What happens next? Would Jey Uso return seeking revenge, potentially forming an alliance with other wrestlers who had grievances against the Bloodline? Would Roman Reigns address the attack directly, either defending his decision or expressing regret? Would Brock Lesnar remain aligned with the Bloodline or return to his usual mercenary role, his services available to whoever could afford his price? And most importantly, was the footage of Jey plotting against Roman legitimate or fabricated? The answers to these questions would determine not just the direction of individual storylines but potentially the entire landscape of WWE programming for the remainder of 2025. What made this situation even more complex was the involvement of Brock Lesnar himself. The Beast Incarnate has always operated under his own rules, appearing when he chooses, leaving when he's finished, beholden to no authority figure and answerable to no moral code within the fictional WWE universe. His willingness to serve as Roman's enforcer represented a significant shift in his character positioning. Lesnar had historically been presented as a lone wolf, someone who worked for himself and destroyed anyone in his path regardless of affiliation. Now he appeared to be operating as muscle for hire, a dangerous precedent that suggested Roman's power had grown to the point where even Brock Lesnar could be controlled and directed. The psychological warfare aspect couldn't be ignored either. Beyond the physical damage inflicted on Jey Uso, this attack sent a chilling message to the entire WWE roster. If Roman Reigns was willing to authorize this level of violence against his own family member, what would he do to wrestlers who didn't share blood ties? The Bloodline had always operated with an undercurrent of threat, the implication that crossing them would result in consequences. But this took that threat from implication to explicit demonstration. Every wrestler who had ever considered challenging Roman, every competitor who had ambitions of disrupting the tribal chief's dominance, now had to calculate whether their career aspirations were worth the potential cost. The following Friday Night Smackdown, emanating from Seattle's Climate Pledge Arena, was the most-watched episode in over 2 years. Fans packed the venue hours before showtime, anticipating some kind of acknowledgement or follow-up to the Vancouver attack. The atmosphere was electric with speculation.
Would Jey Uso appear? Would Roman address the situation?
Would Brock Lesnar show up to deliver additional punishment? The opening segment delivered answers to some of these questions while raising entirely new ones that would reshape everything fans thought they understood about the situation. The show began not with Roman Reigns but with Paul Heyman standing alone in the ring, microphone in hand, that familiar manipulative smile playing across his features. The crowd's reaction was overwhelmingly negative, a chorus of boos that shook the building's foundation. Heyman soaked it in, seeming to draw energy from their hatred, his smile widening as he raised his hands to request silence that would never come. When he finally began speaking, his voice carried that perfect mixture of condescension and false sympathy that has made him one of the most effective talkers in wrestling history. Heyman began by addressing the unfortunate necessity of what had transpired in Vancouver. He spoke about loyalty, about family, about the sacred bonds that hold organizations together and the cancer that betrayal represents to those bonds. He presented the attack not as cruelty but as medicine, painful but necessary to preserve the health of the larger body. The footage shown during Survivor Series, he claimed, represented only a fraction of the evidence collected regarding Jey Uso's treachery. There were additional meetings, additional conspirators, additional plans that extended far beyond simple ambition into active sabotage of the tribal chief's empire. But then Heyman said something that stopped the arena cold. He claimed that Jey's plotting hadn't been his own idea. Someone had been whispering in his ear, manipulating him, feeding his insecurities and ambitions, using him as a pawn in a larger game designed to tear the Bloodline apart from within. The crowd's reaction shifted from hostile to confused.
A puppet master? Another layer of conspiracy?
Heyman paused dramatically, letting the tension build, before delivering the final devastating revelation. The person who had been manipulating Jey Uso, the architect of this entire attempted coup, was none other than The Rock.
The crowd exploded.
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Hollywood megastar, Bloodline patriarch, the most electrifying man in sports entertainment history, was being accused of orchestrating a conspiracy against his own family. Heyman's explanation was simultaneously brilliant and devastating. The Rock, according to this narrative, had grown concerned about Roman's increasing power and independence. The tribal chief had built something that no longer required The Rock's blessing or involvement, had become the face of the company, the central figure around which all storylines revolved. And this threatened The Rock's legacy, his positioning as the ultimate Bloodline success story. So The Rock had manipulated Jey, the most vulnerable member of the family structure, the one still trying to prove himself, still seeking validation and recognition. He had fed Jey's ambitions, encouraged his independence, suggested that Roman was holding him back from his true potential. He had arranged the meetings with executives, facilitated the conversations with board members, essentially creating the conspiracy from whole cloth and positioning Jey to take the fall when it was discovered. Whether Jey realized he was being manipulated or was a willing participant remained unclear, but The Rock's fingerprints were allegedly all over the entire operation. This revelation recontextualized everything. The attack in Vancouver wasn't punishment for Jey's betrayal.
It was a warning to The Rock.
Roman had discovered the manipulation, had traced it back to its source, and had responded by destroying The Rock's pawn in the most public, brutal way possible. The message was clear. Stay in Hollywood, stay out of WWE's business, and stay away from the bloodline that Roman now controlled absolutely. Brock Lesnar's involvement made even more sense in this context. The Beast incarnate had his own complicated history with The Rock, their careers intersecting at various points with varying degrees of professional respect and personal animosity. Using Lesnar as the instrument of this message added additional layers of disrespect and threat.
But was any of this true?
The wrestling community immediately began investigating these claims, trying to find evidence of Rock's involvement or proof that Heyman was fabricating the entire story to justify Lesnar's assault. The Rock himself had been largely absent from WWE programming for months, focused on his film career and various business ventures. His social media presence had been limited to promotional material for upcoming projects with no references to WWE or wrestling beyond occasional nostalgic throwback posts. This absence, which had seemed unremarkable before, now appeared potentially significant depending on which narrative you believed. Within hours of Smackdown's broadcast, The Rock's representatives issued a statement categorically denying any involvement in WWE creative or backstage politics. The statement emphasized that Dwayne Johnson maintained positive relationships with all members of his family, including Roman Reigns, and suggested that Paul Heyman's accusations were fictional storyline elements that should not be confused with reality. The carefully worded statement did everything except confirm whether The Rock would actually appear on WWE programming to address the situation directly, leaving fans in a state of uncertainty about whether this angle would incorporate the actual Dwayne Johnson or remain purely in the realm of fictional references. The wrestling media landscape fragmented into competing camps. Some journalists insisted they had sources confirming that The Rock had indeed been in discussions with WWE about returning to television, that there had been creative disagreements about how his character should be positioned relative to Roman, and that kernel of real-life tension had been exaggerated and fictionalized into the current storyline. Others maintained that the entire Rock conspiracy was pure fiction, creators' way of adding another layer to justify the Survivor Series attack while potentially setting up a massive WrestleMania program if The Rock could be convinced to return for one more run. What made this particularly fascinating was the real-life family dynamics at play. The Bloodline storyline had always drawn heavily on the actual family connections between its members. Roman, Jey, Jimmy Uso, Solo Sikoa, and The Rock all share genuine familial bonds that exist outside of wrestling. Using those real relationships as the foundation for fictional drama creates a unique dynamic where the lines between reality and performance become almost impossible to distinguish clearly. Was there actual tension between The Rock and Roman regarding creative direction and family positioning? Or was this entirely manufactured drama designed to generate exactly the kind of speculation and discussion currently dominating wrestling discourse? Roman Reigns finally broke his silence later in the same Smackdown episode, appearing during the main event segment to deliver what would become one of the most talked-about promos of his career. The tribal chief walked to the ring alone, no entrance music, no pyrotechnics, just a man with something to say. He stood in the center of the ring, title over his shoulder, and addressed both Jey and The Rock directly. To Jey, he expressed something that could almost be interpreted as regret, acknowledging that family makes mistakes, that forgiveness is possible, but that certain lines cannot be uncrossed without consequences. The door wasn't entirely closed, but the price for redemption would be high. To The Rock, Roman's message was far less diplomatic. He acknowledged his respect for everything The Rock had accomplished, the doors he'd opened, the path he blazed. But he made absolutely clear that the bloodline belonged to him now, that the tribal chief answered to no one, not even the most electrifying man in sports entertainment history. If The Rock wanted to return to WWE, he would be welcomed, but not as the returning patriarch reclaiming his throne. He would come back on Roman's terms, within the structure Roman had built, acknowledging the current power dynamic. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. If The Rock disagreed with that arrangement, Roman was willing to settle the matter definitively. The crowd's reaction to Roman's promo was complex and fascinating. Traditional heel-face dynamics had broken down entirely. Some fans chanted for Roman, appreciating his strength and conviction. Others chanted for The Rock, wanting to see him return and put Roman in his place. Still others chanted for Jay, sympathetic to his position as a pawn caught between larger forces. The commentary team struggled to provide a clear narrative framework, unsure themselves whether viewers should be supporting or opposing any of the characters involved. This moral ambiguity, this lack of clear heroes and villains, represented either the pinnacle of sophisticated storytelling or a confusing mess depending on your perspective.
As Smackdown went off the air, one final twist emerged.
The camera caught Jey Uso watching Roman's promo from a backstage monitor, neck brace visible, face battered and bruised, eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions too complex to easily categorize.
Hurt, anger, confusion, but also calculation. Jey wasn't broken.
The beating he'd received hadn't destroyed his spirit. If anything, it had hardened something inside him, transformed something fundamental about his character. The camera lingered on his face for several seconds before fading to black, leaving fans with the uncomfortable realization that this story was far from over. The build-up to the climax was accelerating. WWE announced a special tribal court segment for the following week's SmackDown, where Roman Reigns would officially address Jey Uso's status within the bloodline. Rumors circulated about potential appearances by other family members, about surprise returns, about the possibility of The Rock actually showing up to confront Roman directly. Ticket sales for the next several weeks of programming spiked dramatically. Social media engagement reached levels typically reserved for WrestleMania season.